By 1989, Yugoslavia's inflation hit 1,000%. Within 2 years, the war that broke this country apart had begun. This wasn't random. It was a chain reaction. So how does a debt crisis become a genocide? The real turning point isn't where most people look. It's a constitutional clause from 1974. By the end, you'll understand exactly how a nation falls apart. Josip Broz Tito stood at the center of Yugoslavia's post-war reconstruction, holding together a country made up of 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces, each with its own language, faith, and historic wounds. After 1945, his answer to the region's deep divisions was control through a single-party system, a pan-Yugoslav army, and a web of councils and committees that linked workers, youth, and local leaders to the federal center. The League of Communists of Yugoslavia, with Tito at its head, acted as both referee and enforcer. No single ethnic group could dominate the party or the state. Key posts rotated, and the army's officer corps followed strict quotas to reflect the country's demographic mosaic. For decades, the Yugoslav People's Army recruited Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Macedonians, and others into its ranks, making the military itself a symbol of unity. Security was reinforced by the UDBA secret police, which monitored dissent and suppressed separatist movements before they could take root. Economic recovery drew on youth work brigades and foreign aid from both the West and the Soviet bloc, thanks to Tito's non-aligned diplomacy. On the surface, brotherhood and unity looked real, but underneath, the system depended on Tito's personal authority to mediate disputes and keep rival elites in check. Without him, the Federation's institutions were exposed as fragile. The question was never if old grievances would return, but when, and what would happen when the balancing act ended. Foreign debt ballooned from $3 billion in 1970 to over $20 billion by 1991, pushing Yugoslavia into a cycle of borrowing just to pay interest. As the 1980s wore on, inflation soared, 1,000% in 1989 alone, turning savings to dust and driving prices out of reach for ordinary families. Factories that once symbolized Tito's promise of shared prosperity now stood idle. Unemployment rates doubled, especially among the young, and the black market flourished as official wages lost value week by week. The International Monetary Fund stepped in with austerity plans. Subsidies were slashed, wages were frozen, and the dinar was devalued. Instead of recovery, these measures deepened the pain. Protests erupted in mining towns and city squares, with workers demanding not just higher pay, but an end to what they saw as federal neglect. The sense of betrayal cut across old ethnic lines, yet it also sharpened them. In Slovenia and Croatia, resentment grew at sending money south, and in the poorer republics, many blamed Belgrade for their misery. The economic collapse did not just empty wallets, it emptied faith in the idea of a common Yugoslav future. With every failed reform, nationalist leaders gained a new argument. Only their group could protect its own. The crisis had moved from the balance sheet to the ballot box, setting the stage for political confrontation. By the mid-1970s, Yugoslavia's federal structure was held together by a web of legal guarantees that looked stable on paper but proved paralyzing in practice. The 1974 Constitution granted each republic and autonomous province a near-sovereign right to veto federal laws. Every major decision, from budget allocation to internal security, required unanimous agreement across all 8 federal units. Any single republic could block action, no matter how urgent the crisis. This consensus rule was supposed to protect minorities and prevent domination by any one group, but it also froze the system in place. The rotating presidency, introduced after Tito's death, was meant as a safeguard against power grabs. Each year, a different representative took the chair. But without a central figure to mediate, the presidency became a stage for deadlock. Even routine government business stalled if one member refused to sign off. Disputes over economic policy, language rights, or the handling of unrest in Kosovo and Vojvodina often ended in stalemate. When the Supreme Court was asked to resolve jurisdictional clashes, its rulings carried little force because enforcement depended on the very actors locked in conflict. As inflation soared and protests mounted, the legal machinery designed to guarantee equality instead made compromise impossible. Leaders in Slovenia and Croatia began to see federal paralysis as a reason to chart their own course. The system that once promised autonomy for all now gave every republic a tool to act unilaterally, setting the stage for the next and far more dangerous phase, the rise of nationalist movements determined to break the deadlock by force or secession. On June 25, 1991, Slovenia and Croatia both declared independence from Yugoslavia. The reaction from Belgrade was military intervention. In Slovenia, the Yugoslav People's Army, known as the JNA, moved quickly to seize border crossings. But here the conflict barely lasted 10 days. About 100 people died before the Brioni Agreement froze the fighting and allowed JNA forces to withdraw. The reason for this short war was demographic. Slovenia was overwhelmingly Slovene, over 88%, while its Serb minority was small and scattered, with little capacity for organized resistance. The JNA had no local support base and little strategic interest in a drawn-out campaign. Croatia, by contrast, was a patchwork. The 1991 census showed 12% of its population, almost 600,000 people, were ethnic Serbs, many concentrated in the Krajina and eastern Slavonia. When Croatia declared independence, Serb leaders in these regions announced their own breakaway Serbian Krajina, backed by the JNA. What followed was not a brief border clash, but a grinding civil war. The JNA entrenched itself, local Serb militias mobilized, and front lines hardened into sieges and ethnic cleansing. The Croatian War would last 4 years, with tens of thousands killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. This contrast, 10 days in Slovenia and years in Croatia, reveals the role of ethnic geography. Where populations were mixed and claims overlapped, violence escalated and endured. Where the lines were clear, the army could withdraw. The first cracks in Yugoslavia showed that the map mattered as much as the flag. Bosnia would push this logic to its breaking point. Bosnia and Herzegovina, with its patchwork of Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats, became the deadliest front in Yugoslavia's collapse. After independence was declared in March 1992, the republic fractured along ethnic lines, and the war that followed would claim more than 100,000 lives. The siege of Sarajevo began in April 1992 and would not lift until February 1996, a span of 1,407 days. During this time, the city's multi-ethnic population endured daily shelling and sniper fire. Food, water, and electricity ran out. Children made up a fifth of the casualties. By the end, over 11,000 Sarajevans had been killed, and more than 500,000 people across Bosnia were displaced from their homes. Nowhere did the brutality reach a darker extreme than in Srebrenica. In July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces overran the UN-declared safe area. Over the course of several days, more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were separated from their families and systematically executed. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia would later rule these killings as genocide. Srebrenica was not just a massacre, it was the largest single atrocity on European soil since World War II. By 1995, the violence had reached a dead end. No side could secure outright victory, and the human cost had become impossible to ignore. The world watched as Bosnia's cities and villages emptied, and the promise of multi-ethnic coexistence was buried beneath the rubble. The catastrophe forced the international community to reconsider its hands-off approach, setting the stage for direct intervention. But the question of how to stop the bloodshed and what kind of peace could follow remained unanswered. International intervention arrived slowly, shaped by hesitation and political gridlock. In September 1991, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 713, imposing an arms embargo across Yugoslavia. The embargo, meant to curb violence, instead locked in Serb military advantages and left the Bosnian government exposed. United Nations peacekeepers deployed with limited authority, unable to halt sieges or prevent massacres. Years of stalled diplomacy followed as Security Council divisions blocked decisive action. A shift came in August 1995. After the fall of Srebrenica and renewed offensives, NATO launched airstrikes, Operation Deliberate Force, against Bosnian Serb positions. The bombing, combined with Croat and Bosniak advances, forced negotiations. December 1995 brought the Dayton Accords, ending the Bosnian War and redrawing borders. The agreement imposed a power-sharing system, but cemented ethnic divisions, leaving peace fragile and grievances unresolved. This cycle repeated in Kosovo. By 1998, Serbian crackdowns and KLA resistance spiraled into open conflict, displacing hundreds of thousands. Diplomacy failed again. On March 24, 1999, NATO began a 78-day bombing campaign, Operation Allied Force, targeting Yugoslav forces. The strikes ended only when Belgrade withdrew in June 1999. Kosovo came under United Nations administration through Security Council Resolution 1244, but its status remained in limbo. In 2008, Kosovo declared independence, recognized by many but rejected by Serbia and Russia. Outside force ended the fighting, but the settlements left deep scars. The wars stopped, but disputes over territory and identity endured, leaving the region to wrestle with the consequences of intervention and the unfinished work of peace. Yugoslavia's unraveling wasn't inevitable. It was the result of choices made under pressure. Today, fragile states worldwide face similar fault lines, including economic crisis, political gridlock, and rising nationalism. The lesson is clear. When institutions fracture, peace is never guaranteed. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. Thanks for watching.